You're about to hear one of the most messed up stories ever recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we get into it, go ahead and drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. We really want to know how far and wide these stories are reaching. So in the fall of 1853, out in Chatham County, Georgia, about 12 miles west of Savannah, somebody found a little wooden cross stuck in the ground at the edge of a plantation called the Carwell Place. Now that alone wouldn't be a big deal, except somebody had carved something into the bottom of it. It said, "They are in the ground, but their souls feed the pigs." A traveling merchant found that cross and went straight to the local sheriff. Within one day, 3 kids from the Carwell family had been reported missing. What came next was one of the creepiest investigations anyone had seen in that part of Georgia. And get this, nobody even really knew about it until a historian named Miriam Holcomb dug up old county records way back in 1962. The Carwell plantation was doing really well. They grew rice and cotton and made good money. The main house sat up on a little hill, and if you looked out from there, you'd see rows of slave cabins and fields that went all the way to the swamps. The man in charge was Thaddeus Carwell, a third-generation plantation owner whose grandpa had started the whole place back in 1790. According to county records, Thaddeus owned around 47 enslaved people. His family included his wife Margaret and their 3 kids, Elizabeth, who was 12, Thomas, who was 9, and little Sarah, who was just 6. Now there was a woman named Eliza Brown. She was one of the house servants, about 36 years old. Records show that Thaddeus had bought her 7 years before from a nearby plantation after her previous owner had died. Eliza's job was to take care of the Carwell kids and help out in the kitchen. Other house servants who talked about it years later said Eliza was an amazing cook and was super patient with the children. Margaret Carwell had even written in her home journal that Eliza was really good at her job and stayed quiet and out of the way. But what nobody wrote down was the dark stuff that was going on underneath the surface of the Carwell household. Thaddeus had a reputation around Chatham County for being really harsh with the people he enslaved. There were complaints from neighboring plantation owners because some of Thaddeus's enslaved workers had run away to their properties. But every time someone complained, the local authorities just ignored it. On October 14, 1853, Margaret wrote in her journal, "The children have been especially difficult today. Eliza seems quiet, more closed off than usual. Thomas broke his father's reading glasses and got sent to his room. Elizabeth keeps saying her stomach hurts, but Dr. Whitfield can't find anything wrong with her. The air feels heavy, like a storm is coming." The very next day, October 15th, would be the last day anyone ever saw the 3 Carwell kids alive. Based on testimonies collected months later, that morning started out like any other. The enslaved field workers were already out working before the sun came up. Margaret Carwell went over to a nearby plantation that morning to plan for an upcoming harvest party. Thaddeus had gone into Savannah on business and wasn't supposed to come back until the next day, so the kids were home with Eliza. Elizabeth stayed home from her lessons because her stomach was still bothering her. Thomas was still being punished for the glasses thing, and little Sarah spent the morning playing in the nursery while Eliza kept an eye on her. Another house servant named Samuel Johnson remembered later that Eliza was really busy in the kitchen that day making some special food for the children. She said it was like medicine, Johnson told investigators, something to help settle Miss Elizabeth's stomach. She wouldn't let anybody else get near that pot. By the middle of the afternoon, all 3 kids had eaten the special food Eliza made. By evening, all 3 of them got really sick. They were super sleepy, confused, and eventually fell into such a deep sleep that nobody could wake them up. When Margaret Carwell came home at sunset, she found Elizabeth and Thomas lying in their beds, out cold but still breathing. Sarah was nowhere to be found. What happened over the next few hours had to be pieced together from bits and pieces of different accounts. Margaret immediately sent for Dr. Whitfield, who showed up just before midnight. By then, Thomas had stopped breathing. Elizabeth was still unconscious. A search party went out to look for little Sarah, but it was dark and they couldn't find her. And here's where it gets even creepier. Eliza Brown had completely disappeared too. She wasn't in her room, she wasn't anywhere on the plantation. When people searched the little space where she lived, all they found was a small handmade doll made out of corn husks, the kind kids on the plantation would make. When the sun came up, they found footprints going from the main house all the way to the pig pen at the far end of the property. According to Sheriff Williams's report from October 16th, the pig pen looked like someone had been messing around in there. The dirt had been dug up in several spots. The pigs were acting weird and aggressive. When Thaddeus Carwell got back from Savannah later that day, he ordered the pig pen to be completely dug up. What they found under all that mud and dirt was described in county records in a very cold, no-emotion kind of way. They found pieces of what looked like human bones, small bones and fragments. Nobody officially identified those remains, but the search for little Sarah Carwell was called off. Elizabeth Carwell never woke up. She died 3 days later. Dr. Whitfield wrote that she died from some kind of unknown poisoning that caused her organs to fail. Nobody even did an autopsy on Thomas. They just buried him fast in the family cemetery along with Elizabeth. The manhunt for Eliza Brown spread all over Chatham County and even into nearby counties. The wanted posters called her a murderous Negro woman, average height and build, about 36 years old with a burn scar on her right hand. There was a $500 reward for catching her, alive or dead. For weeks, people searched the Carwell plantation and everything around it. Several enslaved people were interrogated, and by interrogated, I mean beaten and abused for any information about where Eliza had gone or what she had been planning. According to county records, at least 2 people died during those interrogations, and still nobody gave up any useful information. Eliza Brown was never found. This story might have just faded away as one more dark chapter in Southern history, except something wild happened almost 30 years later in 1882. Workers were building a new county courthouse in Savannah, and when they were laying the cornerstone of the old building, they found a sealed metal box. Inside was a handwritten journal. The pages were yellow and old, but you could still read them. The journal was signed simply E.B. and was dated 1853. County officials thought it was either a fake or someone's made-up story, so they just filed it away and forgot about it. It stayed like that until historian Miriam Holcomb stumbled on it in 1962 while she was doing research on something else. What she found was so disturbing she wasn't even sure she should include it in her work. The journal was about 30 pages long and told the story of a woman who had been enslaved on different plantations all over Georgia. She wrote about the abuse she went through every day, the constant humiliations, and what it did to her mind. The scariest parts were about her time at a plantation that was never named but matched the description of the Carwell place perfectly. The master beats his own children, one entry said, not the way he beats us, but with words that cut deeper than any whip. The youngest girl cries at night. I hold her until she falls asleep. The boy is trying to act like his father, learning to be cruel like it's something you practice. The oldest girl watches everything but says nothing. Her eyes get colder every day. Another entry, written about 2 weeks before the Carwell children disappeared, said this: I found Sarah today with marks on her arms. When I asked who hurt her, she said it was Thomas, practicing what their father had shown him. When I talked to Thomas about it, he just said Sarah needed to learn her place. He's 9 years old. The last few entries get really scattered and hard to follow. She keeps writing about a cleansing and freedom through change. The very last entry, dated October 14th, just says, tomorrow they will be free, we all will. Holcomb also dug into old medical records and found something else really disturbing. Dr. Whitfield had treated Elizabeth Carwell several times in the months before she died for feminine complaints inappropriate to her age. No more details were given, but Holcomb pointed out that Elizabeth had just turned 12 only 2 months before she died. In the years after the tragedy, the Carwell plantation slowly fell apart. Thaddeus and Margaret got divorced in 1857, which was a really big scandal back then. Margaret went back to her family in Charleston and died in 1862. Thaddeus got married again in 1858 to a much younger woman, and they had 4 more children together. But none of those kids survived past infancy. When the Civil War started, the Carwell plantation was abandoned as Union troops moved in. Thaddeus reportedly ran away to Texas, and after that the trail goes cold. A man who matched his description was found dead in a Houston boarding house in 1874, apparently from drinking too much. The land from the old Carwell plantation was broken up and sold off in pieces after the war. The main house burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1879. People in the area said the land was cursed, that the ground itself had been poisoned by what happened there. In 1958, workers building a highway through part of the old plantation grounds dug up a small metal container about 3 feet underground. Inside was a corn husk doll and a folded piece of paper. The paper had a list of names on it, starting with Elizabeth, Thomas, and Sarah Carwell, then followed by the names of all 47 enslaved people that Thaddeus owned at the time the children died. At the very bottom of the list was one more name, Eliza Brown, and next to it, written in the same handwriting, finally free. That discovery got people interested in the case again and eventually led Miriam Holcomb to her research project a few years later. She got her findings published in a small academic journal in 1964, but barely anyone noticed. The journal and all the other documents related to the case got stored at Savannah State University, where they just kind of sat there. Then in 1968, a graduate student who was doing research on old plantation life asked to check out the Carwell Plantation records. She checked out several documents, including the EB journal. 3 days later, that student vanished from campus. The journal and everything else she had borrowed never came back. The university's records say the student's name was Elelena Blackwell. But here's the thing, nobody could find any record that a student by that name had ever been enrolled at the university. Local stories and legends in Chatham County still mention the Carwell case from time to time, but the details have gotten all twisted up over the years. Some versions say Eliza poisoned the whole Carwell family. Others claim the children weren't even killed, just secretly taken and raised by Eliza until they could escape north. And some people insist the pig pen story was made up to cover something even worse. But no matter which version you hear, one thing stays the same: the way people describe Eliza Brown, a woman who was pushed so far past her breaking point that she finally snapped back, not a monster, but someone who had been treated as less than human for so long that she started reflecting the same monsterness she was surrounded by. The highway that now cuts through the old Carwell Plantation is super busy. Thousands of cars drive through it every day. Almost nobody knows the history of the land they're driving over. Barely anyone knows about the small, unmarked grave that used to sit at the edge of the property, where every year on October 15th someone leaves a corn husk doll. In 2004, while the highway was being expanded, construction had to stop for a bit when workers dug up bone fragments in the soil. Forensic experts checked them out and said they were pig bones about 150 years old. Construction started back up. That old pig pen area is now sitting underneath the eastbound lanes of the highway, and late at night some drivers say something really weird happens. Their car radios suddenly go to static as they drive over a specific stretch of road, and through that static some people claim to hear what sounds like children's voices. So what really happened at the Carwell Plantation in October 1853? The pieces of evidence we have allow for a lot of different interpretations. Was Eliza Brown a killer who did something unthinkable because of how brutally she had been treated? Was she someone trying to protect children she saw no other way to save, kids who were doomed to either keep hurting others or keep getting hurt themselves? Or was she something more complicated, not quite a victim, not quite a villain, but a woman who decided that freedom was worth the most terrible price imaginable? County records show that in the months after the children died, 6 other enslaved people escaped from nearby plantations. None of them were caught. Some historians think those escapes were inspired by what Eliza did, that her defiance sent a shockwave through the whole area. What happened to Eliza Brown herself, nobody really knows. Some people think she made it north on the Underground Railroad. Others believe she stayed in Georgia and just changed her identity. The truth, like so much of this story, is buried under layers of time and people who really didn't want it found. The corn husk doll found in 1958 was put in the Savannah Historical Society's collection. In 1971, a fire damaged part of the collection. The doll was listed as one of the things that got destroyed. But every October 15th, a similar doll shows up on that unmarked grave at the edge of the old plantation. Nobody has ever seen who puts it there. Like a lot of history about enslaved people, the full truth of what happened at the Carwell Plantation may never come out. Records were purposely destroyed, testimonies were never written down, and the people who could have told the truth were shut up by violence or fear. What we're left with is a kind of shadow story, caught in glimpses through fragments and whispers. A terrible act born from terrible circumstances. Children who were both victims and people doing harm. A woman who decided that freedom, no matter what it cost, was worth it. The land remembers even when the history books don't. And sometimes, late at night on that stretch of highway, radios pick up more than just static. They catch echoes of voices asking us not to judge but just to remember. Remember that monsters aren't born, they're made. Remember that underneath the cleaned-up versions of history are truths too painful to look at head-on. Remember Eliza Brown, who fed her master's children to the pigs, and in doing so maybe fed something else entirely, a hunger for justice that couldn't be satisfied with half measures. When you really think about it, this isn't a ghost story. There's nothing supernatural going on here. It's just human cruelty and human resistance playing out against the backdrop of one of the worst things America ever did to itself. The real horror isn't in what Eliza Brown may have done. It's in the system that made something like that feel like the only way out. The real monsters weren't the pigs eating human flesh. They were the humans eating up other people's lives, dignity, and humanity. And maybe the most disturbing question of all, if you were in Eliza's shoes, what would you have done? The wooden cross that started this whole thing was never found again after being logged as evidence. Sheriff's records say it was stored in the county courthouse, the same building where years later the EB Journal would turn up in the cornerstone. Some questions just don't have satisfying answers. Some stories don't have endings, just echoes that keep bouncing around through time. This is one of those stories. If you ever find yourself driving that stretch of highway outside Savannah, pay attention to your radio. Listen for the static. Listen for the voices underneath it. They're still out there, still in the ground, and something is still being fed. In 1965, Professor James Harrington from Emory University sat down with elderly people in Chatham County as part of a history project. One of the people he interviewed was Ruth Coleman, 97 years old, whose grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation right next to the Carwell property. The transcript of that interview got filed away and forgotten until 2001, but what it says is incredible. According to Coleman, her grandmother used to talk about a woman named Eliza who worked in the big house on a neighboring plantation. Grandmother said this Eliza had lost children of her own, Coleman remembered. 3 babies, all taken and sold away before they could even walk, sold to different places so far away she knew she'd never see them again. Coleman's grandmother had described seeing Eliza sometimes talking to herself out in the kitchen garden, like her children were still right there with her. But she wasn't crazy, Coleman made sure to say in the interview. Grandmother said she was the sanest person on that whole plantation. She just had a plan nobody knew about. That Coleman interview is the only known mention of Eliza Brown having had children of her own, something that never showed up in any of the Carwell plantation records. If it's true, it adds a whole other layer to this tragedy. We're talking about a woman who had already been through one of the worst things a parent can go through. Digging deeper, historian Rebecca Torres found something in 1997 in old sales records from the estate of Eliza's previous owner, a man named Jacob Winters. These records, dated 1846, listed the sale of 3 children, ages 4 years, 2 years, and 8 months old, all described as in good health. The records didn't name the children's mother, but the timing lined up perfectly with when Eliza was at the Winters plantation. Torres also found medical records from Dr. Whitfield showing he had treated Eliza for female melancholia not long after she arrived at the Carwell place. The treatment they gave her was bloodletting and forced hard labor, which was what doctors back then did for what we would now recognize as deep grief and trauma. Maybe the most disturbing thing Torres found was letters Thaddeus Carwell had written to nearby plantation owners. In one letter from April 1852, he wrote, "The house servant Eliza keeps forming bonds with my children that aren't appropriate, especially with the youngest. I've told Margaret to keep a closer eye on her and correct any behavior that's too friendly. We can't have these people forgetting where they stand." A neighbor named William Barrett wrote back and said, "It's a common problem with house servants. They start thinking they're part of the family. I find that sending them back to the fields for a season reminds them of what they actually are." There's no record that Eliza was ever sent to the fields, which tells us that even though Thaddeus was uncomfortable with how close she was getting to his kids, he still needed her too much to do anything about it. That contradiction, using her skills and attachment while trying to squash her humanity, is basically a perfect example of how messed up the whole slave system was. In 2008, an archaeologist named Martin Delaney did a ground-scanning survey of the area around the old Carwell plantation as part of a bigger study. The survey picked up something weird about a mile from where the main house had stood, in what would have been thick woodland back in the 1850s. When they dug it up, they found the foundation of a tiny structure, about 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside they found pieces of handmade pottery, a rusted kitchen knife, and a bunch of little bones that at first looked like animal remains. When they looked more carefully, they turned out to be pig and chicken bones with weird cut marks on them, like someone had turned them into crude tools or something. Even more interesting was a small hollow space under the dirt floor with a sealed glass jar in it. Inside the jar was a piece of fabric that had been perfectly preserved because the jar was airtight. It looked like a little girl's nightgown, and stitched into the hem in barely visible thread were 3 sets of initials, EB, JB, and MB. Delaney's report suggests that the little structure might have been a temporary hiding spot used by Eliza Brown after she fled the Carwell plantation. The nightgown with initials that match her own name, and possibly the names of her sold children, gives us a little window into her as more than just someone who did something horrible. It shows us a mother who carried the memory of her kids with her even while she was running for her life. It complicates the story in a real way, pushing us to understand her actions in the full context of everything she had been through. In 2012, digital restoration of Margaret Carwell's household journal brought up entries that had been too faded to read before. One of them from July 1853 was really disturbing. Margaret wrote, "Found Thomas tormenting one of the kitchen cats today. The poor creature was already dead when I found them. When I asked about it, he said he was just practicing what father showed him in the quarters last week." I need to talk to Thaddeus about doing that kind of thing where the children can see it. The boy is too young to witness such things. Another entry from September, Elizabeth has been spending too much time with her father in his study. She comes back with strange ideas about natural order and who's better than who. At 12, she should be learning music and sewing, not whatever political ideas Thaddeus is filling her head with. He says I baby her that she needs to understand her place in society as a future mistress. I'm worried she's learning the wrong things. And then, most disturbing of all, an entry from just 2 weeks before the tragedy, found Sarah crying in the kitchen. Eliza was holding her and comforting her. When I asked what was wrong, Sarah wouldn't say, she just held on tighter to Eliza. Later, Elizabeth told me that Thomas had taken Sarah to the whipping post and made her watch while their father disciplined 2 field workers for not hitting their work quota. Sarah has been having nightmares ever since. Eliza makes her special tea to help her sleep. I need to tell Thaddeus that the children should be kept away from scenes like that. These journal entries paint a picture of a house where violence was just normal, where kids were being raised to accept and take part in brutal cruelty. They also show that Eliza had made herself a source of comfort and safety for at least the youngest child, which makes what happened later both easier and harder to understand. In 2015, a literature professor named Josephine Wright studied the EB journal found in the courthouse cornerstone, but she wasn't focused on what it said, she was looking at how it was written. Her analysis showed that whoever wrote it had likely gotten some kind of education, which was really unusual for an enslaved person back then. The spelling was consistent, the grammar was structured, and it suggested someone who had regular access to written materials and maybe even some real formal instruction. Wright compared the journal to other writings by enslaved or formerly enslaved people from the same time period and place. Her conclusion: the EB journal looked a lot like writings from educated house servants who had secretly used their owners' libraries. That lines up perfectly with Eliza's role as the children's caretaker. She would have been around during their lessons, quietly soaking up education that was never meant for her. This access to knowledge made her more aware. She understood the system that was holding her down more clearly than most, but it also gave her no official way out of it. Knowledge became both a tool and a weight she had to carry. During a renovation of the Savannah Historical Society building in 2018, workers found a hidden compartment inside an antique desk that had once belonged to Sheriff Williams, the original detective on the Carwell case. Inside was a sealed envelope with a single sheet of paper. It appeared to be a written record of an interview with someone listed only as Witness J, dated November 1853, about a month after the Carwell children had disappeared. Part of it reads, "Witness claims to have seen a Negro woman matching Eliza Brown's description about 14 miles south of the Carwell Plantation, walking alone at night. Witness says the woman seemed calm, not scared at all, and walked like she knew exactly where she was going, not like someone running away." When asked where she was headed, the woman reportedly said, "I am going to my children." When told that the Carwell children were dead, the woman smiled and replied, "Not those children, my children, they are waiting for me." The witness also said that when the Carwell tragedy came up, the woman showed no guilt or sadness whatsoever. Instead, she said, "Some chains can only be broken by the most terrible sacrifice. I have made mine, they have made theirs, now we are all free." The witness also said that when he tried to grab her, the woman pulled out a small bottle from her clothes and threatened to drink whatever was inside if he came any closer. Since he was alone and unarmed, he let her go and went to report the encounter instead. At the bottom of the transcript, Sheriff Williams had written one note: "Account deemed unreliable. Witness J known for making things up and drinking too much." That interview was apparently never made part of the official investigation. Whether this meeting actually happened or was just a made-up story, we can't know for sure, but it's the only account we have of anyone supposedly talking to Eliza Brown after the events at the plantation. If it's real, it means she was alive and free a month later, and she wasn't scared at all. She was walking with confidence and a clear sense of purpose. In 2020, genetic testing of soil from the old pig pen site turned up something unexpected. Mixed in with pig DNA were traces of human DNA, confirming that human remains really had decomposed there at some point. But even more surprising, the analysis found DNA with African ancestry alongside European markers typical of white people from that region. That raises some really unsettling questions about what or who else was actually buried in that pig pen. Had Eliza left other evidence there besides the children's remains? Or had that spot been used for secret burials before October 1853 ever happened? County death records from the decade before the Carwell tragedy show at least 7 enslaved people from that plantation listed as dead, with no cause of death recorded, and there are no burial locations listed for any of them. It was pretty common on many plantations to bury enslaved people in unmarked graves somewhere on the property, often in areas that weren't being used for anything else. Had the pig pen been built over one of those burial spots, or had Eliza chosen that location specifically because it already held hidden suffering? The DNA evidence can't answer those questions definitively, but it does confirm the site held even darker secrets than the original investigation ever turned up. Layers of tragedy packed into the same ground. In 2022, a descendant of Margaret Carwell donated a box of old family papers to the Georgia Historical Society. Among them was a letter that nobody had ever seen before, written by Margaret to her sister in Charleston, dated December 1853, 2 months after the children's deaths. She wrote, "I cannot stay in this house anymore. Every corner holds memories that have become too painful to bear. Thaddeus talks about replacing the children like they were farm animals we lost to sickness. He's already asking around about future marriages, even while I'm still drowning in grief. I keep thinking about Eliza, not with hatred the way Thaddeus does, but with a terrible kind of understanding that gets clearer the more I sit with it. I saw what was happening in this house. To those children, to her, to all of them, I saw it and I did nothing." She continued, "Sarah came to me once not long before it happened. She said, 'Mama, Eliza tells me stories about children who escaped to a place where no one can hurt them anymore.' I thought it was just a sweet little story, something to comfort a sensitive child. Now I understand it was a warning I didn't listen to. And then, the truth, dearest sister, is that I can't bring myself to fully condemn Eliza even knowing what she did. To do that, I'd have to believe that what came before her actions was somehow less of a horror. And I can't keep pretending that anymore. Pray for me because I can't pray for myself anymore. I feel like my soul is just as lost as my children's." This letter, never sent, apparently hidden away for generations, gives us a rare glimpse into Margaret Carwell's mind after the tragedy. It shows a woman starting to question the whole moral foundation of the system she had been part of, realizing her own role in what had happened even while she was grieving. In that way, Margaret too was changed by Eliza's actions, forced to face things she had always managed to look away from. Whether that led to any real change in how she thought or lived, we don't know. History only shows us that she left the plantation within months and never went back. There's a curious little tradition in Chatham County that started sometime in the early 1900s and still goes on today. On October 15th every year, some families put their kitchen knives away in drawers instead of leaving them out on the counter or in a knife block, even if they have no idea why they do it. When a folklorist named Daniel Murphy went around interviewing county residents about this custom in 2024, most people couldn't explain where it came from. "It's just what my mama did," a lot of them said. Bad luck to leave knives out on that day. A few older residents, though, connected it to that woman who worked in the big house kitchen, even though the actual details of what happened had gotten really fuzzy over time. The tradition seems to have started in black families in the area and slowly spread to everyone else, its specific meaning fading away even as the habit itself stuck around. It's basically a kind of cultural memory, something that outlasts the actual facts. Long after the details are forgotten, the behavior stays. A little echo of something terrible preserved in an everyday action. So what do we make of Eliza Brown and the horrific events at the Carwell plantation? History doesn't give us a neat moral lesson to take away. There's no clean ending that gives us justice or closure. We know 3 children died. We know a woman who had herself been deeply wronged likely caused those deaths. And we know that the system that created all those conditions kept on going for years afterward, hurting countless more people. Maybe the most honest thing we can say is this: inside a system that stripped her of every bit of her humanity, Eliza Brown made a choice to take her power back in the only way she could see available to her. That her choice involved horrific violence doesn't say something about who she was as a person. It says something about a system that offered her no other path. The real horror of the Carwell plantation isn't in what one desperate woman may have done. It's in the reality that such desperation was deliberately and systematically manufactured across an entire society. The monstrosity wasn't inside Eliza Brown. It was in the institution that built the conditions where feeding children to pigs could feel like an act of freedom. In the end, we're not left with answers. We're left with questions that echo across time. What does freedom mean when every road to it is soaked in blood? What responsibility do we carry for systems of oppression we were born into but didn't create? And how do we deal with historical horrors that are too painful to face but too important to forget? The stretch of highway that now covers the old Carwell plantation carries thousands of people through it every day, most of them with no idea what's underneath them. But sometimes, late at night, when traffic dies down and the modern world goes quiet, something remains that can't be paved over or erased. Some people say it's just radio interference, a weird glitch from the geography or some nearby power lines. Others insist it's something more, the land itself remembering what happened there, a story too terrible to fade completely from the world. Either way, if you ever find yourself driving that road after dark, you might notice your radio picking up strange signals. Through the static, some travelers claim to hear what sounds like a woman's voice, low, steady, reciting what might be names, too faint to make out clearly but spoken with the rhythm of a roll call or a prayer. And underneath that voice, almost too quiet to catch, something else. The sound of children, not crying, not in pain, but laughing, free. The Carwell plantation is gone, its buildings have crumbled away, its boundaries have been erased by time and new development. The people who lived and died there, enslaved and enslavers alike, have long since returned to the earth. But the story remains, carried forward through little pieces of evidence, through stories passed down orally, through the stubborn work of people who believe that even the most disturbing truths need to be preserved if we're ever going to understand our present. And maybe, in some way that's hard to put into words, Eliza Brown remains too. Not as a ghost or anything supernatural, but as a question that's never been fully answered, a reckoning that's never been fully completed. In the official history, she's a murderer, a monster who committed an unthinkable crime against innocent children. In the counter-narratives kept alive through generations of oral tradition, she's something much more complicated, a woman who refused to keep nurturing the children of the man who had taken her own children away. The truth, as always, lives in the painful space between those two versions, in the recognition that extreme systems of oppression produce extreme responses that humanity denied will eventually assert itself, sometimes in truly terrible ways. If you go to Chatham County today and ask about Eliza Brown, most people wouldn't know the name. But ask about the woman who fed her master's children to the pigs and you might catch a flicker of recognition, a nervous glance, maybe even a little gesture to ward off bad luck. Because some stories never fully die even when we try to bury them under highways in progress and the comfortable lie that the past is really over. They stay in the soil. They feed something that keeps growing. They wait for us to stop and listen.